James Carter had always loved quiet mornings. He liked to wake up early, long before the sun fully stretched its light over the trees, and enjoy the calmness before the day's chaos began. For him, mornings were special. They were a time when he could think, reflect, and do the small things that made him feel free. One of his favorite morning activities was fishing. Not because he needed the fish, but because it gave him peace. Sitting by the water, hearing the gentle splash of the lake, feeling the breeze on his face, it was his escape from stress, his small piece of happiness in a busy world. James lived in a suburban neighborhood that looked perfect from the outside. The lawns were neatly trimmed, the houses all had fresh paint, and the streets were clean. Families waved at each other, neighbors smiled as they walked their dogs, and everything seemed like it belonged in a magazine. But James had learned, over the years, that appearances could be deceiving. Beneath the well-manicured lawns and polite greetings, there were rules and judgments that didn't always make sense, and sometimes, those rules were used to control and exclude people. He had noticed it quietly at first, subtle things here and there. A disapproving glance when he parked his car too close to someone else's driveway, small comments about how he didn't fit in, the way certain families avoided talking to him or his friends. Nothing big enough to complain about, at least not until that day by the lake. It was a Saturday morning when it happened. James woke up early, as usual, made himself a cup of coffee, and grabbed his fishing rod. He put on his favorite old cap, the one he always wore when he fished, and walked towards the community lake. The path was lined with trees, and the sun had just begun to rise, making the water sparkle like it was covered in tiny diamonds. Birds were chirping, and the smell of fresh grass filled the air. Everything was peaceful, and for a moment, James felt completely free. He set up his fishing spot near a quiet corner of the lake, away from the small cluster of families who had arrived for a weekend picnic. He cast his line, the float landing softly on the water, and waited. Time seemed to slow down. He could feel the tension in his shoulders ease, his thoughts becoming lighter. This was his sanctuary, a place where the world's problems seemed to pause for a little while. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, enjoying the moment. But that peace didn't last long. He noticed a figure approaching from the other side of the lake. At first, he thought it was just another neighbor coming to enjoy the morning, maybe someone walking a dog or jogging. But as the person came closer, James realized it was someone from the HOA, the Homeowners Association, the group that claimed to manage the community and enforce rules. They were always around, appearing at the least expected moments, checking on things, measuring things, reminding people of rules that often seemed strange or unfair. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," the man said, his tone polite but sharp. "I'm afraid I need to inform you that fishing here is against the HOA rules. You'll need to stop immediately, and there will be a fine issued for this violation." James froze. He had been fishing there for years, quietly and respectfully. No one had ever told him it was forbidden. The HOA had rules, yes, but they had never mentioned that he, a resident who had lived there for over a decade, could not enjoy the lake. I didn't know," James replied, trying to stay calm. "I've fished here many times before. Is there a specific reason I'm being fined now?" The HOA representative didn't answer his question. Instead, he handed James a small piece of paper, a formal notice of the fine. It was official, stamped, and final. James felt his stomach drop. He couldn't believe what was happening. It felt like a trap, like the community had been waiting for a reason to make him feel unwelcome. As the man walked away, James sat back down, stunned. He looked at the water, at his fishing line, and tried to think rationally. Why would they single him out? He wasn't loud, he didn't cause trouble, he simply wanted to enjoy a quiet morning like anyone else. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had faced small moments like this before. Subtle hints that he didn't fully belong, reminders that he was different. And now, it was in writing, official and undeniable. James felt a mix of emotions: anger, frustration, and hurt. He was angry because the fine was unfair, frustrating because he didn't know how to respond, and hurt because the community he had lived in for so long had chosen to treat him this way. He could see some neighbors watching from their lawns, whispering to each other, curious about the confrontation. The feeling of being judged, of being singled out, made the situation even worse. He thought about what to do next. He could pay the fine, follow the rules, and pretend it hadn't happened. That was the easy choice, the safe choice. But James wasn't someone who backed down when he knew he was right. He wanted justice, not revenge, not in a mean way, but in a way that would make things fair. He wanted to find a way to change the system that had tried to humiliate him. Over the next few days, James spoke to friends and family about what had happened. They were supportive, shocked at how unfair the fine was. Some suggested legal action. Others advised him to move on, to not let the HOA ruin his peace. But James had another idea forming in his mind, one that was bold and unexpected. What if he could take control of the very thing the HOA thought they owned? What if he could turn this situation around, not just for himself, but to show that discrimination and unfair treatment could have consequences? He started researching the lake's ownership. He found out that the HOA didn't actually own it. They managed it, yes, but it was privately held. This meant there was a way for him to buy it. At first, it seemed impossible. Could someone like him really do that? But the thought excited him. The idea that he could turn an unfair fine into an opportunity for empowerment made his heart race. James knew it wouldn't be easy. Buying a lake required money, planning, and strategy. He didn't have billions, but he had a steady job, some savings, and a sharp mind. Over the next weeks, he began to make careful plans. He looked into investments, financial advice, and legal options. Every evening, after work, he would sit at his kitchen table, sipping coffee, writing down ideas, calculating possibilities. The unfair fine had sparked something in him, a determination not just to get back at the HOA, but to change the rules entirely. Even as he planned, James continued to fish in the lake whenever he could, knowing that the HOA could fine him again at any time. But now, he didn't feel powerless. Each moment by the water became a reminder of what he was working towards. The fine was no longer just an insult, it was a challenge, one he intended to meet in his own way. Neighbors continued to gossip about the incident. Some felt sympathy, others curiosity, and a few whispered criticisms. But James didn't care. He had realized an important truth: fairness and respect were earned, and sometimes, you had to create your own opportunities when the world seemed determined to treat you unfairly. The lake, with its calm water and quiet corners, became more than a place for fishing. It became a symbol of his resilience, his determination, and the journey that was about to change everything. And so, what began as a simple morning by the lake, a simple fishing trip, turned into the spark of a plan that would not only confront unfairness but rewrite the rules entirely. James sat there for a long time that morning, looking at the water, feeling the breeze, and imagining a future where he could take back control, not with anger or hate, but with cleverness, patience, and determination. Little did the HOA know, the fine they had issued, meant to embarrass and control him, was only the beginning of a story they would never forget. And for James Carter, this small act of injustice would become the first step in a journey that would change his life and the lives of everyone in that neighborhood forever. After that humiliating morning by the lake, James Carter couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The fine he received was more than just a piece of paper. It was a reminder that even in a neighborhood where he had lived for years, he wasn't truly seen or respected. The injustice burned inside him, but instead of letting it crush him, James let it inspire him. He spent the next few days quietly thinking, analyzing, and considering his options. He didn't want to react impulsively or angrily, he wanted to act smartly, strategically. He wanted to turn the situation around in a way that was fair, creative, and, most importantly, permanent. James started with research. He went online and looked into property laws, HOA regulations, and the legal ownership of the lake. He was careful to read every detail, noting what the HOA could and could not control. He discovered that while the homeowners association managed the lake, the actual ownership was held by a private company. The HOA only had rights to set certain rules for residents, but they didn't actually own the property. That tiny fact gave James an idea, a seed of possibility that quickly grew into determination. If the HOA didn't own the lake, then why couldn't he? For the next few weeks, James turned his apartment into a headquarters. His kitchen table was covered with papers, notes, and printouts. He had charts showing how much money he had saved, projections for investments, and contact lists for people who could help him. Every day after work, he would spend hours studying property management, financial planning, and investment opportunities. He called financial advisors, asking questions about loans, purchasing property, and legal procedures. Some were skeptical at first, but James explained the situation clearly, and slowly he found professionals willing to guide him. At the same time, James had to be careful not to draw too much attention to himself. The HOA had a reputation for gossip and scrutiny. If they suspected he was planning something, they might try to block him or complicate things. So he continued to appear as though nothing had changed. He waved politely to neighbors, helped when someone asked for a hand with yard work, and even attended the occasional HOA meeting, always calm, always respectful. Behind the polite exterior, however, he was quietly plotting a move that would change the entire community dynamic. James also had to think about money. He had savings, yes, but buying a lake required far more than what he had in his bank account. So he looked into multiple sources. He had a stable job, which provided a consistent income, but he knew he would need more. He began investing carefully, learning about stocks, bonds, and real estate opportunities. Each night, he tracked the progress of his investments, taking careful notes. Slowly but surely, he started building the funds he would need. It was a process that required patience and discipline. Every small step mattered, and James was determined to make each one count. During this time, he also reflected on the kind of person he wanted to be. James didn't want revenge in the cruel sense. He wanted justice. He wanted to show that unfair treatment could be met with intelligence, perseverance, and strategy. This was important to him. He knew that if he acted out of anger, the satisfaction would be temporary, and the consequences could be negative. But if he acted smartly, planning each move carefully, he could achieve something lasting, a statement not only for himself but for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly. The neighborhood began to notice subtle changes in him. Some neighbors whispered about how focused he seemed, about the quiet determination in his eyes. Others assumed he was simply going through a phase, or perhaps investing in a new business. No one suspected the real plan. How could they? James had learned to keep his thoughts private, to let his actions speak louder than words. Each visit to the lake, each day spent planning at home, was a step closer to a goal that seemed impossible to everyone else but clear to him. One evening, as he sat by his apartment window watching the sun set, James felt a wave of clarity. He could see the lake from a distance, shimmering under the last rays of sunlight. He imagined himself walking along the shore, casting a line into the water without fear of being fined, without judgment, without someone questioning his right to enjoy a peaceful morning. That vision became his motivation. Every calculation, every phone call, every financial decision was now fueled by the desire to turn that vision into reality. James also considered the practical steps. He reached out to real estate agents and legal experts, quietly inquiring about procedures for purchasing a property like the lake. He learned about negotiations, contracts, and valuation. It was complex, but James was methodical. He kept meticulous records, made lists, and created timelines. He divided his plan into stages: research, funding, legal preparation, negotiations, and final purchase. Each stage had to be completed with precision. He couldn't afford mistakes, not when the goal was so big, so transformative. At the same time, he reflected on the lessons from his past experiences. The fine had taught him that even small acts of discrimination could have deep emotional impact. He remembered how humiliated he felt, how alone he seemed at that moment. But he also remembered the strength he felt as he processed the situation, as he decided not to let it defeat him. That mix of hurt and determination became the fuel for his plan. He knew that when he finally succeeded, it would not only be a victory for himself but a powerful message about resilience, intelligence, and self-respect. Friends and family continued to support him. They were curious but cautious, offering advice when asked. Some warned him about risks, telling him it could be complicated or financially straining. But James listened carefully, considering every warning as part of his strategy. He adjusted his plan, made contingencies, and kept moving forward. It was not a reckless pursuit but a disciplined, thoughtful journey. Weeks turned into months, and James's plan began to take shape. He had grown more confident in his understanding of property ownership and legal strategy. He had begun setting aside more funds, taking calculated risks in his investments. Each step brought him closer to the moment when he could finally take control of the lake. The small humiliations of that morning, which once seemed so large, were now reminders of why he needed to succeed. They were markers on the path toward a goal that was becoming increasingly achievable. Throughout this time, James never lost sight of the lake itself. It was more than water and land. It was freedom, peace, and a symbol of his right to exist without unfair limitations. Every time he visited, he thought not only about the fish in the water but about the larger stakes. The lake represented an opportunity to reclaim dignity, to assert ownership in a world that sometimes tried to deny it. It became a source of inspiration, a place where ideas could form and plans could grow. James also began to think about how he would use the lake once he owned it. He imagined welcoming respectful visitors, creating a space where people could enjoy nature without judgment. He thought about fairness, about creating rules that would protect everyone's rights, including his own. This wasn't just about retaliation, it was about shaping a space that reflected his values, a place of justice, calm, and respect. The vision of the lake under his ownership kept him focused, even on the hardest days. By the end of the year, James had completed most of the preparation he needed. He had financial resources, legal advice, and a clear plan for negotiations. He had also built a mental and emotional framework to handle the challenges ahead. The unfair fine that had once humiliated him was now a distant memory, replaced by focus, determination, and a sense of purpose. James had transformed frustration into action, anger into planning, and humiliation into a vision for justice. One quiet evening, as he reviewed his notes and financial projections, James felt a surge of anticipation. He knew the next steps would be critical. The negotiation, the purchase, and the moment when he could finally take control of the lake were approaching. But he also knew that he was ready. Every hour of planning, every careful decision, every small sacrifice had prepared him for this moment. He wasn't acting out of impulse, he was acting with precision, strategy, and clarity. James Carter had started as a man fined unfairly for a simple act of fishing. But now, he was a man on a mission, quietly and steadily moving toward a goal that would change not just his life but the dynamics of his entire neighborhood. The journey ahead was still challenging, but James felt confident. He had learned patience, strategy, and resilience. And he knew that when the time came, he would act decisively, not out of anger, but out of careful, clever planning. The unfair fine had sparked a fire, and that fire would not be extinguished until he had reclaimed what was rightfully his. The morning sun was just beginning to rise when James Carter left his apartment. The crisp air carried the faint smell of dew, and the streets were quiet, still holding on to the calm of early dawn. James walked with a sense of purpose that no one in the neighborhood had ever seen before. To anyone passing by, he appeared ordinary, just another man on his morning walk, but inside, his mind was alive with strategy and plans. Today was the day he would start the process of turning his long-standing idea into reality. James had scheduled a meeting with a local real estate agent who specialized in unique properties. Lakes, private land, and other rare parcels were her expertise, and James knew she could guide him through the complicated process. He arrived at her office, a modest building tucked between a coffee shop and a small bookstore, and was greeted with a polite smile. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said. "I understand you're interested in a very particular property." "Yes," James replied confidently. "I'd like to discuss purchasing the lake in my neighborhood." The agent raised an eyebrow but quickly composed herself. "That's ambitious. Lakes don't come on the market every day. Do you have experience with property investments?" James nodded. "I've done my research. I know the legal ownership, the processes, and the steps we need to take. I'm ready to move forward carefully and properly." For the next hour, they reviewed documents, maps, and records. James asked detailed questions, clarifying every point and making notes. He wanted to ensure that nothing could go wrong, no surprises could appear, and no loopholes could prevent him from achieving his goal. By the end of the meeting, the agent agreed to help him initiate negotiations with the current owner of the lake. James left the office with a sense of controlled excitement. The plan was no longer a distant dream, it was becoming tangible. Over the next few weeks, James meticulously prepared for the purchase. He coordinated with his financial advisor to secure the necessary funds, making sure that everything was in place before making any formal offers. He reviewed legal documents, studied contracts, and even prepared a backup plan in case the negotiations became challenging. He wasn't relying on luck, he was relying on preparation, research, and strategy. Meanwhile, the neighborhood remained completely unaware of what James was doing. They went about their lives, enjoying their morning coffees, walking their dogs, and discussing small matters like lawn care or upcoming community events. The HOA continued its usual enforcement of rules, oblivious to the fact that the man they had fined for fishing was quietly preparing to take full control of the lake. The irony was not lost on James. Each time he thought about their ignorance, a quiet smile crossed his face. Patience, he reminded himself, was part of the strategy. The first step in the purchase process was an official appraisal of the lake. James hired a certified appraiser to determine its market value. The appraiser walked the shores, measured depths, and examined the surrounding land, taking detailed notes. James watched from a distance, feeling a mix of excitement and satisfaction. He could already imagine the day when he would finally own this place that had been the site of humiliation, frustration, and now determination. Every rippling wave, every tall tree along the shore, seemed to hold a promise of a new beginning. After receiving the appraisal, James reviewed the numbers carefully. He knew he could afford it, but he also knew negotiations could be tricky. The current owner had no reason to sell to him, a single individual from the neighborhood, unless James presented an offer that was both fair and attractive. So he crafted an offer that was generous, backed by a clear plan and immediate financial capability. His attention to detail and preparedness reflected the months of careful research and planning. The day of the negotiation arrived. James met with the owner in a small office near the lake. The air was tense, but James remained calm. He presented his offer clearly, laying out every aspect of the deal, from immediate payment to future intentions for the property. The owner listened, asking questions, and James answered each one with patience and clarity. He did not brag, he did not threaten, he simply presented a strong, thoughtful case for why the sale should happen. After what felt like hours, the owner nodded thoughtfully. "You've clearly done your homework," he said. "I wasn't expecting such a thorough offer. I like your plan, and I think we can proceed." Relief washed over James, but he maintained his composure. He knew the deal was not yet finalized, and rushing could jeopardize everything. Over the next few days, lawyers reviewed contracts, double-checked documents, and ensured that every detail was legally sound. James remained deeply involved, reading every line, asking questions, and confirming that the transaction would leave no room for dispute. During this time, the neighborhood continued its usual routines, completely unaware of the storm quietly brewing in the background. James saw neighbors walking by, waving hello, unaware that the man they had once fined for a simple act of fishing was moments away from gaining full authority over the lake. The thought was satisfying in a calm, almost poetic way. He didn't feel vengeful, he felt justice, fairness, and the fulfillment of careful planning. Finally, the day of the closing arrived. James, his financial advisor, and the legal team met at the office with the current owner of the lake. Papers were signed, checks were exchanged, and the transfer of ownership was completed. James now held the official title. The lake, once a place of humiliation and restriction, was legally his. He could feel the weight of the moment, a mix of satisfaction, excitement, and empowerment. Months of careful planning, patience, and diligence had led to this moment. After the paperwork was completed, James walked to the edge of the lake. The water glistened in the afternoon sun, rippling gently with the wind. He picked up a small pebble and tossed it into the water, watching the ripples expand. This lake was no longer just water and land, it was freedom, justice, and a symbol of persistence. He could finally enjoy it without fear, without judgment, and without restriction. But James wasn't done yet. The HOA, which had fined him for fishing, would soon learn that their assumptions about power and control were outdated. He decided to set clear rules for the property, reflecting fairness and respect. No one could enter without permission, and he could manage access in a way that preserved the lake's peace. It wasn't about revenge, it was about protecting the lake from abuse and ensuring that no one could impose unfair restrictions on him or anyone else in the future. James sent a polite notice to the HOA, informing them of the change in ownership and the new rules. The message was simple, factual, and firm. The tone left no room for argument, and it clearly communicated that the lake was now private property under his control. While some neighbors would be surprised or upset, James knew that he had acted legally, ethically, and thoughtfully. As word spread, reactions were mixed. Some neighbors were shocked, some were frustrated, and some were silently impressed by James's determination and strategic thinking. But James didn't react to their opinions. He walked along the shore, feeling the cool breeze and listening to the water lap against the edge. For the first time since the incident, he felt a profound sense of peace. The lake was his, and it represented more than property, it represented dignity, fairness, and the power of thoughtful action. In the following days, James began exploring ways to enhance the lake. He thought about planting trees, adding small docks, and creating spaces where respectful visitors could enjoy nature. But he always reminded himself that the most important aspect was fairness and protection. The lake was a symbol of his journey from humiliation to empowerment, and he intended to honor that journey in every decision he made. Neighbors began to realize that their assumptions about James had been wrong. The man they had once fined for fishing was not only resilient but intelligent, strategic, and capable of turning a moment of injustice into a long-term statement of empowerment. Some began to admire his dedication, even if they were frustrated by the consequences. It was clear that James had changed the neighborhood dynamics, not through confrontation or anger, but through preparation, strategy, and legal action. One afternoon, James stood by the lake, watching the sunlight dance on the water. He reflected on the journey, the humiliation, the planning, the careful research, and finally, the purchase. He had transformed a moment of injustice into a long-lasting symbol of fairness and empowerment. The lake, once a source of frustration, had become a testament to his perseverance, intelligence, and patience. James knew that life would continue, that new challenges would arise, and that the neighborhood would continue its routines. But he also knew that he had set a precedent, one that proved that unfair treatment could be met with thoughtful action, careful planning, and strategic patience. He had turned a moment of disrespect into an opportunity, and in doing so, he had claimed more than a lake, he had reclaimed his dignity. The morning sun spilled over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across manicured lawns and quiet streets. James Carter stood at the edge of the lake, coffee in hand, watching the gentle ripples move across the water. It was calm and peaceful, exactly as he had imagined. But today was not just another morning. Today, the neighborhood would begin to learn the consequences of their actions, and James was ready. He had spent the previous evening finalizing the rules for his new property. They were simple, clear, and fair, but they sent a strong message: the lake was private, and he had full control. No one could fish, swim, or enter without explicit permission. James carefully printed the notice and arranged to send it to every household in the area, including the HOA. He did not write it with anger or revenge in mind. The letter was professional, concise, and legally sound. It stated the facts, outlined the rules, and reminded everyone that the lake was now under his ownership. By mid-morning, the first wave of reactions began. Mrs. Thompson, a neighbor known for her sharp tongue and strict adherence to HOA rules, had spotted the letter in her mailbox. She quickly called her friends, waving the paper as if it were evidence of some bizarre prank. "Can you believe this?" she exclaimed, voice trembling with indignation. "James Carter owns the lake now? How is this even possible? He can't do this." Meanwhile, the HOA board members were in a state of disbelief. They had spent years enforcing regulations, issuing fines, and maintaining control over the neighborhood's public spaces. Now, the one property they had assumed they could always manage, the lake, was no longer under their authority. They held an emergency meeting, trying to figure out what to do, but James had already covered every legal requirement. He had paid the full price, signed the contracts, and ensured that every detail complied with the law. There was no room for argument. James, aware of the mounting tension, remained calm. He took a walk along the lake shore, reflecting on the months of planning, research, and patience that had led to this moment. The water sparkled under the sun, reflecting not just the sky but the satisfaction he felt. He thought back to the day he had been fined for fishing. The memory was no longer painful, it had become motivation. That single act of unfair treatment had set in motion a chain of events that had now culminated in this moment of empowerment. As the day progressed, more neighbors arrived at the edge of the lake, curious and confused. Some walked with cameras and phones, snapping photos of the water and the newly installed signs that clearly stated the lake was private property. Others approached James directly, demanding explanations, their faces a mix of anger and disbelief. James listened patiently to each question, responding calmly and clearly. "This is my property now," he explained. "I purchased it legally, following all procedures. These rules are for everyone's safety and respect. I am happy to answer questions, but the lake is private, and access is controlled by me." Some neighbors scoffed, insisting that the HOA should still have authority. Others muttered about legal loopholes, imagining ways they could challenge him. But James had anticipated these reactions. He had consulted with lawyers, reviewed contracts, and made sure that his ownership was unassailable. No one could legally overturn the purchase, and that fact frustrated the neighbors even more. As news spread, the local media picked up the story. Reporters arrived, cameras rolling, capturing the spectacle of a quiet man taking control of the lake and changing the neighborhood dynamics in a single stroke. Interviews were conducted, neighbors voiced their opinions, and James remained composed. He answered questions with clarity, never letting the drama of the moment disturb his focus. He understood that perception mattered as much as legality, and he presented himself as fair, rational, and fully in control. The HOA, feeling cornered, tried to contact James directly. They sent emails, letters, and even made phone calls, hoping to negotiate access or reverse the situation. James responded politely but firmly. "The lake is my private property. Rules are clear. Unauthorized entry is not allowed. Please respect the law and the ownership rights." His response left no room for misinterpretation. One afternoon, a group of neighbors attempted to approach the lake, hoping to fish or swim despite the new rules. They were met with a polite but firm warning from James. "You are trespassing. Please leave the property immediately," he said. The group argued, but James remained calm, showing them the legal documents proving his ownership. Slowly, they realized that resistance was pointless and left, muttering under their breath. James spent the next few days reinforcing the boundaries of the lake. He installed small, tasteful signs indicating private property and set up markers along the shoreline. He did not want to appear hostile or aggressive, his goal was clarity and fairness. Everyone could see where the lake began and ended, and the rules were displayed prominently for all to follow. Interestingly, some neighbors began to reflect on the situation. A few approached James politely, apologizing for their previous assumptions and expressing admiration for his determination. They recognized that the man they had underestimated was intelligent, strategic, and capable of protecting his rights. James responded graciously, acknowledging their words but maintaining the focus on fairness and the rules of the lake. As the week progressed, the HOA realized that they needed to adjust their approach. Their attempts to regain authority over the lake were futile, and continued resistance would only make them appear unreasonable. They sent a formal acknowledgement of James's ownership, expressing their intention to respect the property and follow his rules. While the message was reluctant, it marked a turning point in the neighborhood dynamics. The HOA had lost control, and James had proven that careful planning, patience, and legal action could triumph over assumptions and bias. During this period, James also focused on improving the lake. He hired a small team to clean the shoreline, remove debris, and plant new trees along the edges. He thought about creating a small sitting area where respectful visitors could enjoy the view, ensuring that the lake remained beautiful and peaceful. The process was meticulous and deliberate, reflecting the care he had taken in every step of this journey. Neighbors began to notice the changes. The lake, once overlooked or taken for granted, now sparkled with clarity and order. Birds returned to the newly planted trees, and the water seemed fresher, almost alive with energy. Some neighbors admitted quietly that James had transformed the lake into something beautiful, even if they had been angry at first. However, not all reactions were positive. A few individuals tried to stir conflict, questioning James's authority and hinting at possible legal challenges. James handled each situation with patience and clarity, never allowing emotions to dictate his responses. He understood that fairness and calm action were more powerful than anger or confrontation. Each encounter reinforced his sense of control and satisfaction. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had adjusted to the new reality. The lake was under James's ownership, the rules were respected, and the HOA had accepted the change. The story of James's purchase and the neighborhood's reactions spread further, becoming a local tale of determination, strategy, and empowerment. James had turned a moment of humiliation into a long-lasting demonstration of fairness and legal strength. One evening, James sat by the lake as the sun dipped below the horizon. The water reflected the warm colors of the sky, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. He reflected on the journey from being fined for fishing to owning the lake, enforcing the rules, and reshaping the neighborhood's understanding of fairness and respect. Every step had been deliberate, every decision carefully considered, and every outcome aligned with his values. He realized that the lake was more than water and land, it was a symbol of his resilience and intelligence. The struggle had not been about revenge but about reclaiming dignity, ensuring fairness, and demonstrating that preparation and patience could overcome unfair treatment. James felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he had acted wisely and legally, achieving his goals without compromising his principles. In the days that followed, life around the lake continued, but the dynamics had changed. The neighborhood now recognized James as a figure of respect and strategic thinking. People approached him politely, some seeking advice, others simply acknowledging his accomplishment. James maintained his calm demeanor, always emphasizing fairness, clarity, and respect in every interaction. The lake itself became a serene and beautiful space, carefully managed and protected. James took pride in every detail, from the clean shoreline to the planted trees and clear water. It was a testament to what could be achieved with patience, planning, and legal knowledge. The once humiliating experience of being fined had been transformed into a long-term victory, not just for James but as a lesson in fairness and strategic thinking for the entire neighborhood. And so, James Carter, the man who had once been fined unfairly for fishing, stood by his lake every morning, a quiet smile on his face, knowing that he had turned a moment of injustice into a lasting symbol of dignity, intelligence, and empowerment. The neighborhood would never look at him or the lake the same way again. The sun rose slowly over the neighborhood, casting a golden glow across the lawns, streets, and the now pristine lake. James Carter stood at the edge of his property, looking over the water with a calm smile. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of surprises, confusion, and tension, but now, things were finally settling into a rhythm that reflected fairness and respect. He took a deep breath, enjoying the cool morning air, and considered how far he had come. The HOA had sent a formal letter acknowledging his ownership, but James knew their acknowledgement was more than just words. Their previous attitude of control had been replaced with a quiet respect, a recognition that the rules were clear and the law was on his side. Still, James knew that some neighbors had lingering doubts or resentment. He had anticipated this, and he was ready to ensure that the resolution was both lasting and peaceful. The first sign of real change came that afternoon when the neighborhood held a small meeting at the local community center. It was a gathering organized by residents who had been both curious and concerned about the lake. James had been invited not as a guest, but as a central figure. As he walked into the room, heads turned. Some people whispered quietly, others nodded in acknowledgement. Everyone wanted to see the man who had taken control and turned a moment of humiliation into a story of triumph. James addressed the crowd with confidence and calm. "I understand that many of you were surprised by recent events," he began. "I also know that the lake has been an important part of this community for many years. I respect that, and I want to ensure that it can still be enjoyed responsibly and safely." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The lake is private property, and there are rules. But I am committed to maintaining it and sharing it in a way that is fair and respectful to everyone." A few neighbors, hesitant at first, raised their hands. One elderly man, Mr. Harris, spoke slowly but firmly. "James, I was angry at first. I didn't understand why you bought the lake or what your intentions were. But now I see that you acted fairly. The lake looks better than it ever has, and your rules are clear. I just want to say, thank you for being reasonable." James nodded, smiling warmly. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. I want the lake to be a place of peace, not conflict. I hope that with these rules, we can all enjoy it safely and with respect for one another." The room was quiet for a moment, and then a ripple of applause spread through the crowd. Other neighbors began to speak, offering cautious compliments and acknowledging the changes James had made. Even some who had been skeptical or angry started to see the fairness in his actions. The message was clear: James had turned a moment of confrontation into an example of wisdom, patience, and strategic thinking. Back at the lake, James continued to make improvements. He had installed small benches along the shore, added trash bins to keep the area clean, and planted flowering shrubs that would bloom in the spring. He had also worked with a local wildlife expert to ensure that birds, fish, and other animals could thrive. The lake had become a symbol not just of ownership, but of care, responsibility, and balance between human activity and nature. A week later, a small celebration was held at the lake. Neighbors were invited to enjoy the view, take photographs, and witness the transformation. James gave a brief speech emphasizing fairness, cooperation, and community respect. He reminded everyone that the lake was private, but that sharing responsibly was always welcome. The atmosphere was cheerful and respectful, a stark contrast to the tension and confusion of previous weeks. Even the HOA attended the event. They walked carefully along the shore, observing the improvements and nodding in approval. Their previous attempts to reclaim authority had failed, but they were willing to accept the reality of the situation. They realized that James had acted legally, respectfully, and thoughtfully, and that continued resistance would serve no purpose. Slowly, the board members approached him, offering polite congratulations. One board member, Miss Reynolds, who had been particularly critical at first, spoke candidly. "James, I admit I underestimated you. Your actions have been fair, professional, and impressive. The lake looks wonderful, and your rules are clear. I think the neighborhood will benefit from your leadership here." James accepted the words graciously. "Thank you, Miss Reynolds. I appreciate your recognition. My goal was never to create conflict, but to ensure fairness and respect. I hope we can all move forward together." Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood adjusted to the new reality. People respected the signs, followed the rules, and even expressed gratitude for the improvements James had made. Children came to the lake with their parents, carefully staying within permitted areas, and families enjoyed picnics on the benches. The water was clear, the surroundings clean, and the sense of peace restored. James also became a source of guidance for neighbors. People approached him with questions about property, legal matters, or simple advice about community issues. He responded patiently, offering insights without judgment. Over time, he became a figure of respect, not just because of his ownership of the lake, but because of his calm, fair, and thoughtful approach to every challenge. Some neighbors who had been vocal critics became his allies. They realized that James's actions had created a more organized and beautiful space, benefiting everyone who respected the rules. They began to speak positively to others, sharing the story of how patience, planning, and fairness had brought resolution. The neighborhood itself seemed to change, becoming more cooperative and respectful as a result of this single experience. As spring approached, the lake became a hub of quiet activity. Birds nested in the trees James had planted, fish swam in the clear water, and families visited to enjoy the serenity. James often walked along the shore in the early mornings, reflecting on the journey. What had begun as a moment of humiliation being fined unfairly had transformed into a long-term victory that impacted not just him, but the entire community. The story of James Carter spread beyond the neighborhood. Local newspapers, online forums, and community newsletters shared his story as an example of fairness, determination, and strategic thinking. People admired how he had handled adversity with patience and calm, turning a negative experience into a positive outcome. Many saw it as a lesson in how knowledge, preparation, and respect for the law could empower individuals in the face of unfair treatment. Years later, the lake remained under James's care. Its beauty and tranquility were maintained, and the lessons of fairness and respect endured. Neighbors remembered the transformation not just in terms of property ownership, but in the way a single individual could inspire change through patience, intelligence, and calm action. James's story became part of the neighborhood's history, a tale often shared with children and new residents as an example of fairness and determination. In the quiet evenings, James sometimes sat by the water, watching the sunset and the reflection of the sky in the lake. He thought about the journey, every challenge, every moment of doubt, every interaction that had shaped the outcome. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had acted wisely, legally, and with integrity. The lake was no longer just water, it was a symbol of perseverance, fairness, and the power of careful planning. Neighbors often approached him with smiles, sharing their appreciation for how the lake had become a place of peace and beauty. Children waved as they ran past, families picnicked along the benches, and even the birds seemed to settle more comfortably in the trees. Every element reflected the effort and care James had invested, creating a lasting impact that extended far beyond the simple boundaries of property ownership. James had learned an important lesson himself, that respect, fairness, and strategic thinking could overcome moments of unfairness. He had turned a negative experience into a story of empowerment, demonstrating that one person, acting thoughtfully and patiently, could change the world around them in meaningful ways. And so, the neighborhood thrived. The lake, once a point of contention, became a symbol of harmony and thoughtful action. James Carter, the man who had been fined unjustly, had not only reclaimed his dignity but had created a lasting positive influence on his community. His story was remembered, retold, and celebrated as an example of how fairness, patience, and intelligence could triumph over adversity, leaving a legacy that would inspire generations to come.